What would you do if every door in your life had been closed to you, if the last person who loved you was in the ground, and the only family you had left counted you up like a debt and paid you off in small bills? For June Calloway, 19 years old and alone in the world, this was not a question. It was a Tuesday. Her uncle settled her like an account, put $47 in her hand, and closed the ledger. And with 10 of those dollars, the only 10 she would ever spend on anything foolish, everyone said, she bought an old army crate at a surplus auction, olive drab and stenciled and heavy as sin, a crate the government itself had written off as junk. The town laughed about it for a week. But inside that crate, behind 40 years of dust and a false bottom no pry bar had ever found, was something that had been missing since 1944, a secret that would rebuild a broken town, restore a dead man's good name, and turn a cast-off girl into someone the whole county would one day stand up for. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. June Calloway was raised in the back room of a garage, and she said later that she could not remember a time in her life when her hands were clean. Her father, Walter Calloway, kept a one-man repair shop in the town of Alder Grove, in the dry country east of the mountains, and he could fix anything that turned, caught, fired, or rolled. Tractors with cracked blocks. Wedding watches. The bank's adding machine. A neighbor's radio that only played when it rained. Walter was a quiet man, a widower since June was 3, and he raised his daughter the way he rebuilt engines, patiently, methodically, and with the absolute conviction that anything broken could be made whole again if you were willing to take it apart slowly enough. He taught her the trade the way other fathers teach prayers. She learned that a wrench is not a hammer and a hammer is not an argument. She learned to lay her tools out in order before a job and to wipe them before they went back, because a tool put away dirty is a tool that fails you twice. She learned the language of tolerances, how 1/1000th of an inch is the difference between a bearing that lasts 30 years and one that seizes in a week. She learned that rust is only patience on the metal's part, and that penetrant oil and time will loosen what brute force never will. Never force a thing, Junebug, he told her, over and over, in the low unhurried voice he used for everything. If it won't come, you don't know it yet. Learn it. Then it'll come. When she was 12, he ground down a little 4-inch wrench so its jaws would sit true in her small hands, and he filed her initials into the handle, JC, plain as a maker's mark, and gave it to her not as a toy but as a working tool, hers alone. She carried it in her pocket every day of her life after that. She was carrying it the day he died. Walter Calloway died the way he had lived, quietly and without fuss, of a heart that gave out on a cold morning in November of 1946, between the first turn of a crankshaft and the second. He was 51. June found him with his tools laid out in order, and she said nothing at the funeral, and she did not cry where anyone could see. She was 18. The will was simple, because there was almost nothing to leave. The garage building belonged to the bank. The tools, the lift, the stock. Walter's brother Silas arrived from 3 counties over with a ledger of his own and a long memory for every loan and every kindness he had ever extended, and within a month the estate was, in his word, settled. Silas Calloway was a feed and seed man, a deacon, a person who believed that every human arrangement could be expressed as a column of figures, and he took his niece into his house the way a man takes in an unwanted piece of freight, recorded, resented, and shelved. For 11 months June lived in a narrow room under his roof and worked without wages in his store, and she learned how a person can be made smaller without anyone ever raising a hand. Her meals were accounted. Her clothes were remarked upon. When a traveling mechanic offered her a job, real wages, a man's wages, because word of Walter Calloway's daughter had traveled, Silas refused on her behalf, at the dinner table, in front of her, as though she were not sitting there. "The girl owes me," he said. That was all. "The girl owes me." Then came the morning in the spring of 1947 when he called her into his back office and set his ledger square on the desk between them, and turned it so she could read the column, and showed her, itemized, in his fine clerk's hand, what her keep had cost him for 11 months, offset against what her father had owed him at death, arriving at a figure he had clearly prepared in advance. He counted out $47 onto the blotter. He said, "That closes it, June. I've done right by you, and nobody can say otherwise." He did not shout. There was nothing to shout at. It was arithmetic, delivered as fact, and the coldest cruelty in the world is the kind that believes it has been fair. June did not argue. She had learned long before that you cannot talk a closed mind. She went up to the narrow room and packed 2 dresses, her father's wool coat, her mother's Bible, a photograph of Walter standing beside a tractor he had no business being able to fix, and, at the very bottom of the bag, where it had always lived, the little 4-inch wrench with her initials filed into the handle. She was 19 years old. She had $47. And she walked out of her uncle's house with the door left open behind her, because closing it felt like more ceremony than the occasion deserved. She rode the bus west, back toward the only geography that had ever felt like hers, and watched the country change through a streaked window, the green, settled farmland giving way to dry hills, and the hills to long pale valleys where the towns stood apart from one another like thoughts a man has lost. She had a plan, if you could call it that, Alder Grove. Her father's town. The place where his name still meant something, even if his shop was gone. It was at the transfer stop, in a wind-scoured little junction town, that she saw the handbill nailed to the depot wall, Army Surplus Auction, Saturday, Uncle Sam's Loss Your Gain. She had a day to wait and nowhere to be. And her father's daughter could no more walk past a sale of good tools than a riverman could walk past water. The auction was held in a roped-off yard behind a warehouse, and it was mostly what such sales always were, crates of mess kits, coils of rope, boots in unlucky sizes, tent canvas gone to mildew. But at the back of the yard, sitting alone on a dolly, was a transit chest unlike the others, olive drab, steel-bound, maybe 4 feet long and 2 feet deep, with rope handles and a stenciled marking half scabbed away by rust. What could still be read stopped her heart a little. Not the contents line had been painted over in hasty black, some time long ago, but beneath it, in the smaller stencil the army used for routing, pay division, and a serial, and a date. 1943. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Tibbets, saw her looking and came over doing her the great kindness, as he saw it, of talking her out of it. That one's a white elephant, miss. Depot over east wrote it off years ago. Inventory says tent stakes, but it weighs like an anvil and the lid's seized solid. We couldn't inventory it proper, so it went on the books as junk. Cost the army more to open it than it's worth. You'd be buying a problem. He meant well. They always mean well, don't they? But June Calloway had been raised on the gospel that rust is only patience on the metal's part, and a seized lid is not a verdict, it's just a question nobody has answered yet. When the lot came up, nobody bid. Why would they? It was a box nobody could open, full of nothing anybody wanted. June raised her hand at $5. A man in the back laughed out loud. The bidding, such as it was, died at 10. Sold, said Tibbets, shaking his head the way a man does when he has watched someone do a thing he cannot prevent, to the young lady, for $10. And that is how June Calloway, cast out with $47 to her name, spent 10 of them on an old army crate, while grown men who should have known better stood in the sun and grinned. Tell me, would you have bid? Or would you have kept your $10 and walked on, like everyone else did that day? Let us know in the comments what you would have done. Getting 140 pounds of steel-bound chest from a junction town to Alder Grove took the better part of her remaining money in 2 days, and by the time the freight wagon set it down in the dirt in front of the place she had rented, if rented is the word for a leaning one-room claim shack at the north edge of town, with a roof that admitted the sky in 4 places, June had $31 left in the world, plus a crate everyone said was worthless and a house everyone said was worse. The first weeks were not beautiful, and this story will not pretend they were. She cut and tacked tar paper over the roof holes, her thumbnails splitting on the lathing nails. She rehung the door on new leather hinges because there was no money for steel ones. She dug out the collapsed privy and reset its posts in gravel, the way her father had taught her posts ought to be set, and she hauled water from the creek 2 buckets at a time until the day she took apart the yard pump, freed its rusted leathers with penetrant oil and patience, and made it draw again, at which point several of her neighbors, who had been watching the Calloway girl the way you watch weather, began to watch her differently. Her hands changed. They had always been a mechanic's hands, but now the knuckles thickened and the palms went hard as hoof, and she stopped noticing splinters. She ate beans and biscuits and the occasional kindness of a rabbit snared in the brush. And there were nights, she admitted this to no one, but there were nights, when she sat on the crate itself, because it was the sturdiest furniture she owned, and looked at the 4 tar paper patches on her ceiling, and wondered whether Silas Calloway had been right about her all along, and whether $47 and a dead man's lessons were really enough to build a life on. It was at the general store, in the 3rd week, that she met old Mr. Tobin. Elias Tobin was 81 years old, a quartermaster sergeant from the First War, a man who had spent his whole working life counting other people's property, and he shuffled up beside her while she was pricing nails and said, without preamble and without quite looking at her, the strange sentence she would turn over in her mind for months: "The army never loses a thing, girl. It only forgets where it set it down. Everything that's missing is somewhere, waiting on a patient hand." Then he bought his tobacco and shuffled out, and left her standing there with the nails in her hand, turning the words over like a bolt whose thread she couldn't quite catch. She did not understand him yet. She would, and it was that same week that Harlan Voss first came to call. Voss owned the bank in Alder Grove and half the mortgages in the valley, and he did not come out to the north edge of town for anyone, yet there he was, standing in her yard in a clean hat, offering her $25 for the crate. $25 for a thing the whole town knew she had paid 10 for and that everyone said was junk. She should think on it, he said. A bird in the hand, he said. June thanked him politely and said it wasn't for sale, and watched him drive away, and thought about what her father used to say when a customer offered too much money for a machine sight unseen: he isn't buying the machine. He's buying what he knows that you don't. Now, why do you suppose a banker would offer 2.5 times the price for a crate of tent stakes? Hold that thought. The clue, when it came through her ears and not her eyes, and it came because she was her father's daughter. She had taken to studying the crate in the evenings, the way Walter used to study a balky engine before ever laying a wrench on it, walking around it, listening to it, learning it. She had already discovered that the seized lid was seized in a strange way, not the long, gradual seizing of 20 years of weather, but the stubborn grip of a gasket that had been laid with care by someone who had meant the inside of that box to stay dry for a long time. Tent stakes do not need a gasket. She had noted that, and filed it away. Then one evening, working by lanternlight, she dropped a bolt. It struck the top edge of the crate and rolled down across the lid. And she heard it. A mechanic's child hears the world differently than other people, the way a musician hears a room. The bolt rolled across the front 2/3 of the lid with the low, dead iron thunk of solid matter, and across the back third of the lid, it went hollow. A higher note. A drum note. She picked the bolt up and rolled it again. Dead. Dead. Hollow. She took her knuckles and rapped the lid the way her father had rapped 1,000 engine blocks, listening for a crack. Solid, 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 and then a space. And memory arrived the way it always does, all at once and entire. Walter Calloway's voice, years ago, in the garage in Alder Grove, showing her a smuggler's trick a bootlegger had built into a truck's fuel tank. People hide things in the wrong place, June bug. They hide them at the bottom, and the bottom is the first place a searcher looks. The smart ones hide things in the lid, or the walls, in the part of a thing nobody thinks of as a place at all. The crate's lid was 4 inches thick. 4 inches, for a sheet steel lid on a box of tent stakes. She had assumed it was reinforced for stacking. Now she stood in the lantern light with her knuckles resting on the metal and her heart going like an engine with the timing advanced, and she understood that the lid was not a lid. It was a wall. And walls have rooms behind them. She did not sleep much that night. Would you have? She opened it the way Walter had taught her to open everything, slowly, in order, and by learning it first. In the morning she took the measurements properly, with her folding rule and her calipers, and the numbers told her the same story the bolt had told her. The outside depth of the crate was 22 inches. The inside depth, measured from the lid's inner face to the floor, was 17. 5 inches of the crate's depth did not exist inside the crate. A false bottom, no, not a bottom. A false top, a hidden compartment, 5 inches deep and the full length of the box, built into the lid structure itself, invisible from above and below, sealed behind a seam that had been welded, ground smooth, painted, and then left to rust into invisibility for 3.5 years. Whoever had built it well. That, she thought, was the first true thing she knew about him. He had built it well. This was not a thief's hurry. This was a craftsman working in secret, taking his time, meaning his work to outlast a search. She did not attack the weld. Force is the last tool, never the first. Instead she found the seam with her feeler gauge, a hairline, thinner than the page of a Bible, and she worked along it the way you work along any seized thing. Penetrant oil, laid on with a feather and left to creep, then the careful application of temperature, warming the seam with a borrowed torch the way Walter used to warm a rusted nut, letting the two metals argue with each other until the bond between them began to doubt itself. It took her the better part of 2 days. Her neighbor, a carpenter named Ellis Brandt, saw the torchlight flickering in her shack past midnight and came to the door in his suspenders, and she told him only that she had a repair to finish, and he nodded and left her to it, though the next morning, without a word being asked or offered, he fixed her sagging gatepost while she worked, and drove off before she could thank him. That is how help arrives in a place like Alder Grove. It arrives through the hands, not the mouth. On the second evening, the seam gave. Not with a crack, with a sigh. A long, soft exhalation of air that had not been breathed since the winter of 1944, air that smelled of machine oil and old paper and something faintly, impossibly sweet, like a drawer in a house where someone once kept lavender. The hidden panel lifted on its welded hinge, stiff but true, and June Calloway looked down into the 5 secret inches of the crate, and she did not move for a long moment, and she did not make a sound. Then, silence. Then her own voice, alone in the shack, saying the only thing there was to say, "Oh, Pa. You should see this." The compartment was lined in oilcloth, stitched by hand, and everything in it was packed with a terrible, loving neatness. There were 124 paper-wrapped packets of banknotes, each packet $100, each packet tied with twine and labeled in a small, careful hand. $12,400. In 1947, in a valley where a good man earned $30 a week, it was not a sum of money. It was a weather system. Beneath the packets, in a tin document box, lay the rest of it, and this is where the story stops being about money. A paymaster's ledger, leather-bound, listing 214 names with a sum beside each, a camp payroll, June realized, the wages of 214 soldiers, entered and ruled and signed. A bundle of war bonds, $800 worth. A photograph of a young woman standing in front of a White House, holding a baby, both of them squinting into the sun. And a small carved wooden bird, a wren, no longer than her thumb, whittled with such patience that you could see the individual strokes of the knife in the feathers, its paint worn at the breast where a child's fingers had once held it. And there, on top of everything, where it could not be missed, lay an envelope gone the color of weak tea, sealed with wax, and addressed in the same small, careful hand to no one and to everyone. To whoever finds this. June sat down on the floor of the shack with the lantern beside her, and she broke the seal, and she read. The letter was dated the 11th of January, 1944. To whoever finds this. My name is Thomas Ayers, First Lieutenant, Paymaster of this camp, and if you are reading these words then the thing I feared has happened. I have not come back for this box, and time and the army have done what they do, which is to forget. Hear me plainly, because a man's name is all of him that will survive this war. This money is not stolen. It is the payroll of 214 men, listed in the ledger you now hold, and I removed it from the safe because there was a man in this camp, I will not write his name, he knows it, and God knows it, who meant to take it and hang the taking around my neck. I could not prove it. I could only prevent it. I built this box to keep the men's wages safe until I could see them paid, and I built it well, because a paymaster owes his men at least that much. I was ordered overseas before I could set it right. I write this the night before I ship out. Perhaps I will return and burn this letter and laugh at it. Perhaps you are laughing at it instead. If so, then I am gone, and the truth of Thomas Ayers died with me, and this box is all the testimony I have. They will have told you my wife is Eleanor. They will not have told you that Eleanor and our daughter died of the fever in December, while I was 300 miles away counting other men's money, and that the army could not even spare me long enough to bury them. I carved the bird for my girl on her 2nd birthday. It is the only thing of hers I have left to give, and I give it to you, stranger, because the dead have no pockets. So here is my instruction, and I charge you with it as the one condition of this gift. See the men paid, if any of them can still be found. If they cannot, pay their widows. If their widows cannot be found, then pay the world back in their names, and do not spend $1 of it on your own comfort until you have spent some of it on someone else's. And whatever else you do, stranger, make something live again. That is all I ask. That is everything I ask. You were patient enough to find this. Be patient enough to use it well. Thomas Ayers, First Lieutenant, January 11th, 1944. June read the letter twice, and then a third time by the last of the lantern oil, and though she was not a person who cried, she had not cried at her father's grave, in front of anyone. She sat a long while with the little wooden wren in her palm, worn smooth where a dead child's fingers used to hold it, and the shack was very quiet. Here was the thing she could not stop turning over, and maybe you are turning it over too, that a man the army had written down as a thief. She would learn that part soon enough, that the camp had recorded the payroll as embezzled, and Lieutenant Ayers' name with it, had spent his last free nights on Earth not defending himself, but protecting the wages of 214 men and carving instructions to a stranger he would never meet. Missing since 1944. Not lost. Missing. Waiting, exactly as old Mr. Tobin had said, on a patient hand. If you're still with us at this point in the story, take a moment to subscribe. This channel is full of stories about the things the world wrote off too soon. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done with $12,400 in 1947, at 19 years old, with no one to answer to? Because that is the real question, isn't it? Not what was in the crate. What was in June? She thought about the train east. She thought about it honestly, the way her father had taught her to think about everything. A city, a house with a roof that did not admit the sky, a life in which no one had ever heard of Silas Calloway's ledger. $12,400 could buy that life outright, in cash, with change left over. Nobody would ever know. The letter was addressed to whoever found it. She had found it. By every law she knew, it was hers. And then she took out her folding rule and her calipers, so to speak, and measured the situation the way Walter would have. The money was not a windfall. It was a payroll. It had a destination written on it, 214 destinations, and a dead man had kept it safe for 3.5 years at the cost of his name, trusting that whoever found it would be the kind of person who finds false bottoms, patient, careful, and unwilling to force a thing. She lay awake most of the night. Sometime before dawn, the engine of it turned over and caught. She began quietly, the way she did everything. First she wrote to the War Department, one letter, in her plain hand, stating what she had found and where, and asking 2 questions, whether the army claimed the money and what had become of Lieutenant Thomas Ayers. The answer came back in 6 weeks, and it was better than she had dared hope. The crate and its contents had been written off as a total loss in 1944. The army wanted no part of it. And First Lieutenant Thomas Ayers, paymaster, had been killed at Anzio in the spring of 1944, 3 months after sealing his letter, and had died, officially, under a cloud, the payroll that vanished with him marked down as theft, his widow's pension denied on account of it, except there was no widow, was there? Eleanor was already gone. There was no one left to be cheated except the truth itself. So June paid the world back in their names, and she did it the way a mechanic does it, systematically, part by part. She took the ledger to Mr. Tobin, who had spent a life in quartermaster's records, and the old man sat with it for a week with his magnifying glass, weeping twice and denying it both times, and helped her trace what could be traced. Most of the 214 men could not be found, or were dead, or had vanished into the wide country the way soldiers did. 41 of them, or their widows, or their grown children, could be. 41 envelopes went out of the Alder Grove post office with money orders inside and a copy of a dead man's letter, and no return address but a friend of Lieutenant Ayers. The rest she spent in Alder Grove, and this is where the town began to change its mind about the Calloway girl, not through speeches, because she never made one, but through the small transactional miracles that are the only language a town like that truly reads. She bought the old livery stable on Main Street, the one Voss had been letting rot so he could take the land for taxes, and paid a crew to re-roof it, and hung a sign, Calloway's Garage. She bought the bank's note on the Abernathy place, where the widow had been one dry season from losing it, and she did not tear the note up, because she understood pride. She simply rewrote it at terms a widow could live with, and found a pot of stew on her doorstep every Sunday for the rest of her natural life. She set up Otto Beck's boy as her apprentice. She paid Ellis Brandt to build her proper workbenches, at his price, without haggling, which in Alder Grove was a form of respect so rare it was talked about for a month. She did not buy herself a new dress until the second winter, and people noticed the arithmetic of her, the way they had once noticed the arithmetic of Silas Calloway. She paid cash. She paid on time. She paid fairly. In a valley where Harlan Voss had spent 20 years teaching everyone that money only ever moved in one direction, toward the bank, here was a 19-year-old girl proving that it could be made to flow uphill, toward the people who did the work. A man like Harlan Voss does not fall in a day, and he does not fall to a blow. He falls the way a rusted bolt falls, slowly, and then all at once, and mostly from the inside. He tried, of course. When the story of the crate got out, and stories like that always get out, Voss went to the county seat and came back with a lawyer's letter claiming the crate had been stolen government property, and that he, as a concerned citizen, was prepared to see the matter properly investigated, and that June might save herself considerable trouble by placing what remained in the custody of the bank. His bank. But the War Department's letter was already framed on the wall of Calloway's garage, where every farmer in the valley could read it while they waited on a tire repair. The army had written the crate off, sold it lawfully, and claimed nothing. Voss had no case. Worse for him, he had no mystery anymore either, because a reporter from the city paper had picked up the story, and the story, printed under the headline "To Paymaster's Box," did something no courtroom could have done. It made Thomas A.S. famous. The army, embarrassed in the gentle, devastating way that only public sentiment can embarrass an institution, reviewed the file, and in the autumn of 1947 it quietly corrected the record. The payroll of 1944 had not been embezzled. It had been protected. The pension was restored to a widow who was 3 years in her grave, which the army knew, and paid anyway, to no one, because some debts are settled on the books so they can be settled in the heart. And Silas Calloway read the story too, 3 counties over. He arrived in Aldergrove in October, in his good coat, with his ledger's worth of arithmetic all prepared. He had calculated, on the drive, what fraction of a found fortune might reasonably be claimed by the uncle who had provided the finder 11 months of room and board. He got as far as the door of the garage. June was under truck when he came in, and she slid out on the creeper and stood up and wiped her hands on a rag, and she looked at him the way you look at a part that no longer fits the machine. He talked for a while. She did not interrupt him. When he was finished, she said the only speech anyone ever heard her make on the subject: "You settled with me last spring, Uncle Silas. $47. You counted it out yourself and told me nobody could say you hadn't done right. I've kept your books exactly. We're square." Then she turned the wrench in her hand back to the truck, and there was nothing in the garage for him to argue with, because you cannot argue with arithmetic once it has turned and pointed the other way. He drove home the same day. No one threatened him. No one needed to. That is the thing about quiet, methodical justice. It leaves a man perfectly free and perfectly powerless, standing in the ruins of nothing but his own accounting. Within 2 years, Voss's bank was half empty, because a valley that has seen money flow uphill once will never again believe it can only flow down. He did not go to jail. He simply became irrelevant, which for a man like Harlan Voss was a considerably longer sentence. A year is not a long time, except when it is the year a life gets built. By the autumn of 1948, Calloway's garage had 2 lifts, a tow truck with June lettered on the door in gold leaf, and a waiting bench that had become, without anyone deciding it should, one of the places Aldergrove gathered. Farmers came in with broken pumps and left with their news. Widow Abernathy's stew still appeared on Sundays. Ellis Brandt's workbenches bore the honourable scars of daily use, and his gate-post repair had held through a winter and a half. Mr. Tobin, 82 now, came in every afternoon at 3 and sat in the good chair by the stove, and drank the coffee June poured him without being asked, and told the story of the crate to anyone who hadn't heard it, which by then was no one, and to many who had heard it twice. Otto Beck's boy could now time an engine by ear, and June had begun, without ever quite announcing it, to teach him the way Walter had taught her: tools in order, wiped before they go back, and never force a thing. If it won't come, you don't know it yet. And on the wall of the office, in a frame Ellis Brandt made from salvaged barn oak, hung the letter. Not the original. The original lived in the document tin, in the safe, but a fair copy in June's plain hand, and beneath it the ledger, open to the page where 214 names began, and beneath that, on a little shelf, the photograph of Eleanor and the baby squinting into the sun, so that the people of Aldergrove who read it, and people did, regularly, the way people visit a grave or a view, would understand whose money had re-roofed the feed store and carried the Abernathy place, and paid for the new bell in the church tower that Voss had refused for 20 years to fund. In one corner of the office there was a door that had not been there before, and behind it a room, and in the room a brass plaque, and the plaque read, "The A.S. Fund. For the paying of debts the books don't show." It was where the remainder of the payroll went, dollar by dollar, year by year, a doctor's bill here, a burnt-out barn there, a train ticket for somebody's daughter who needed one. No one applied to the fund. It simply found people, the way a patient hand finds a false bottom. The town never called it charity. They called it what June called it. They called it payroll. It is a late evening in the fall of 1948, and the garage is closed, and June Calloway stands at the workbench with the day's tools laid out in order and wiped clean, and the light coming through the west window is the color of old brass. In her left hand she holds a little 4-inch wrench, its jaws ground true, her initials filed into the handle by a dead man's careful fingers, the tool her father made for a 12-year-old girl so that her small hands would fit the world's work. In her right hand she holds a wooden wren, no, Longer than her thumb, its paint worn at the breast where a dead child's fingers used to hold it, carved by another man, another father, on a second birthday a long way from Anzio. 2 men she had outlived. 2 gifts. One of them had taught her how to open things. The other had given her something worth opening, and a set of instructions for what to do once it was open. She turned them both over slowly, the way you turn a bolt whose thread you finally understand. She was 19 years old, and she had been cast out of her uncle's house with $47 to her name, and she had spent 10 of them on an old army crate that everyone said was junk. And the crate had been exactly what the world always is, her father could have told her, a seized thing, waiting on penetrant oil and patience and a person willing to learn it before they try to force it. Everything that's missing is somewhere, Mr. Tobin had said. Waiting on a patient hand. She put the wrench in her pocket, where it lived. She set the wren on the shelf beside Eleanor's photograph, where it lived. And she turned off the lantern and stepped out into the dusk and locked the door of the place she had made live again, and walked home through the town that no longer laughed, with the church bell, the new one, ringing 6 o'clock over the valley, clear as a struck thing that was finally, properly hung. Thank you for staying with us for this story of patience and payrolls. If you were moved by June's journey, by a girl who measured twice, forced nothing, and paid the world back in a dead man's name, please give this video a like, and share it with someone who was once counted out and counted themselves back in. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you won't miss our next tale. And before you go, tell us in the comments, what is the thing in your life that everyone else wrote off as worthless, an object, a place, a person, a dream, that you held onto anyway? What did you carry out of the hardest chapter of your life, the way June carried a 4-inch wrench at the bottom of her bag? We read every story you leave us. Next time, the widow who inherited a riverboat that hadn't run in 30 years, and the cargo still sealed in its hold. Until then, be well. And remember, the army never loses a thing, and neither does the world. It only forgets where it set it down. Everything missing is somewhere, waiting on a patient hand.